Okay, so it's been a while since I've done I think it's been about a week since we've done a Q&A live stream. Good morning from the UK. It's what, nearly 9 a.m. in the morning. We've had some very, very hot weather here in Europe. It's cooled down here in the UK for a little bit, but in France, Spain, Germany, Italy, they've got a real bad heat wave at the moment. And of course, in a couple of weeks, we've got the Women's Euros kicking off. Obviously, the Tour de France in France, Wimbledon. So there's some major sporting events taking place on the backdrop of this major heat wave. So that'll be very interesting to see how that impacts the various events that are taking place. Obviously, the FIFA World Cup venues for the 2026 World Cup have been announced, and the host cities. I'm very, very surprised Chicago and Denver aren't on that list of cities to host the next World Cup after Qatar. I think they've missed a trick there a little bit. I'm surprised Canada only get two and Mexico only get three cities as well. Obviously, the majority of the tournament is taking place in the US. What's up is I've got a bit of a suntan. What's up? I was going to do some videos yesterday in regards to some more club sports history videos, and I was going to do another video in regards to the World Cup venues that are going to take place in the host cities in 4 years' time for the US, Canada, and Mexico World Cup. The host cities have been announced. I've got the list. Where's my list of host cities? Books upside down, that would help. We have the notebook up the right way. So the host cities, yes, they've been announced. 16 cities in total for the 2026 World Cup, because it's a 48-team tournament. That's one of the criticisms, is it's a 48-team tournament. In Canada, you get Toronto and Vancouver. They're pretty safe bets. MLS franchises play there. Mexico, you get Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. Honestly, ask your parents or grandparents about the 86 and 1970 World Cups and the Azteca and the semi-final between West Germany and Italy, for example, and the group stage game between England and Brazil in 1970. The USA locations, obviously the New York, New Jersey, Los Angeles, Dallas, Kansas, Houston, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Seattle, Santa Clara, which is based in San Francisco, Boston, and Miami. I am very, very surprised that Denver and Chicago are not on that list. I'll break down the stadiums in due course. There are some stadiums that will need some modifications for the tournament. I know Toronto's stadium will be expanded for the World Cup. They've got 4 years to do that. It's a fantastic stadium. It's one of the smallest stadiums that have been selected, and work needs to be done. So that is actually technically a provisional list. Things can change, as we saw with the Euros. Stadiums got dropped. As we've seen with the Rugby League World Cup, stadiums that were on the initial list are no longer being used. So anything is possible, but they are the locations that FIFA and the organisers have chosen. It's going to be an interesting tournament because it's not only over 3 or 4 time zones, but it's also over 3 countries. I think with it's going to be interesting, as it's the first time since 2002 as well that there's been co-hosts of a World Cup. So the organising committee, that's going to be very, very interesting. Yes, I'm also surprised that Kansas City being the only city in the flyover states in the Midwest. You could argue that Dallas and Houston are on the same time zone, but they're in Texas. But I am surprised that Chicago isn't on that list, and Denver is not on that list. Soldier Field in Chicago, if it was given a bit of an update, would be a fantastic World Cup stadium. I am surprised they haven't gone there. Whether it would have taken too long to bring the stadium back up to FIFA standard or get the modernisation complete is another thing. But I am surprised simply because of the time zone differential between the East and the West Coast. Obviously, the East Coast is only 5 hours behind Europe, or 5 to 6 hours behind Western Europe, whereas the West Coast is 8 to 9 hours behind Western Europe, and that's where a lot of your TV viewership is going to come from. it was a chance to try and grow the sport in the Midwest and the flyover states and the central part of the US. It is a chance. Yes, you could argue it isn't as popular with how the MLS has grown up over the last, well, it will be 30 years when this tournament kicks off since the MLS first had its first match. How the MLS has evolved since 1996. I've done videos on the MLS. Uh, yes, it's that East West Coast kind of development. Very similar to like how the all the other major leagues have uh, predominantly started up, mostly on that northeast corridor of the US. Uh, but yeah, when this World Cup kicks off, it would have been 30 years since the MLS first had its first ever inaugural match. So I think that's also important in regards to hosting the tournament in the US and Canada and Mexico. And of course, with Mexico, it would have been even longer since their last time hosting a World Cup. It would have been like what, 50 years, I thought. 40, well, yeah, 50 years. It would have been since the final in the Azteca in 1986. So in that in that regard, yes, 40 years, sorry, since the Azteca final in '86. So for them, it's a big tournament as well. Um, the fact that the Azteca is the first stadium alphabetically as well tells you all you need to know about um, why they've chosen those locations. But yes, I think this was an opportunity to try and grow the sport in the Midwest and to a wider audience. I'm also surprised Montreal isn't on that list as well. Um, very, very surprised by that. But I understand that the locations they've taken games to, they already are, MLS locations and the Mexican top flight locations. So I do understand why they've taken games there. It will be interesting to see how the tournament pans out and how teams qualify because it is an expanded tournament. Um, Did I watch the grand final between the Stormers and the Bulls? No, I didn't. I didn't watch the United Rugby Championship grand final. The fact that it was an all South African affair sums up the issues with the former Celtic League, which became the Pro League when the Italians joined to now the United Rugby Championship. There are issues within the financial side and the structural side of European club rugby outside of the UK and France. Well, outside of England and France, should I say. The Welsh game is in dire financial straits. The South Africans, obviously, I've got South African neighbours, and the discussion behind, the collapse of Super Rugby in its original format. Uh, I was arguing it was a flawed concept from the beginning. We were then arguing about, well, not arguing, but discussing the fact that the South Africans produce so many players. Look at all the top international sides and club sides in Europe. They've all got at least one South African expat player on them. It's just a production line of talent. Uh, To be fair, a game at Mile High Stadium would have been sweet. Surprised I didn't pull the trigger on that one. I'm surprised Kansas City. I would have rather been US and Canada to co-host. Mexico's enough stadiums to do it. It's to do with the fact it's an expanded World Cup, and therefore you need a co-host, and it is a chance for the infrastructure to be improved. But again, they were going against Morocco for hosting rights for the tournament. They get awarded the tournament over Morocco. Um, and one of the simple facts is the sporting infrastructure is already in place. Yes, Mexico has hosted two World Cups. The Azteca will be hosting its third World Cup. It is looking a very dated stadium considering it was built in 1966. Yeah, it's an old stadium. Uh, but the infrastructure in the US, Canada, and Mexico is already there. The experience with the Mexicans, the US, and the Canadians, all of them have hosted major sporting events since, well, in their existence as countries. Canada is obviously the most recent with the experience in regards to hosting a major international tournament with the Women's World Cup back in 2013. So they've already got that experience from being a host nation of organising and putting the fan zones in place. The US, obviously, it would have been 30 years um, since the the formation of the MLS. So for them, that is a big moment. And Mexico, 40 years since the hand of God. So Mexico, again, another fantastic um, footballing nation. The Aztec is an iconic stadium, absolutely iconic stadium, and it gives a contrast, because Mexico is at altitude. Mexico City and Guadalajara are quite high altitude. I think Monterrey is as well, and therefore that will be a contrast to the east-west coast of the US and Canada, with being more close to sea level. That altitude and heat having an impact. Alfonso Davis, ooh, Alfonso Davis. Right? Oh, it's a difficult question. I don't. I'm going to say this quite politely. I don't really follow religiously um, football in North America. So therefore, until I get to see some matches with him play, there you go. That's Alfonso Davis. Alfonso Davis. I've got to check up. There's so many Davies playing, so many Alfonso's playing. It's ridiculous keeping up with them all. It's too early in the morning for me. Speaking kind of, did you watch the Canadian GP qualifying alongside? I heard about it. The weather conditions, also the FIA coming in and discussing the porpoising issue or the vibrations of the car. Toto Wolff not being happy with other team principals because Toto Wolff and he's allowed to complain when others aren't. Um, yeah, bad weather has interrupted qualifying. Mercedes still struggling. There's Leclerc's got to start from the back of the grid. Verstappen's obviously on pole. The Gilles Villeneuve circuit is one of my favourites, but it doesn't really allow for much overtaking. The problem with when you've got basically a semi-street circuit, and I'm not a big fan of street circuits anyway. Um, they're all well and good playing video games of them. We're actually watching motorsport of them. It's painful. And North American street circuits are absolutely diabolical, in my opinion, when it comes to actual entertainment value of a race weekend. Um, but Montreal is one of the better semi-street circuits. Um, it is one of the better ones. I mean, it, you've got to not run wide. Basically, you've got to be so accurate with your performance when you are racing around Montreal because there is no runoff. You get it slightly wrong, especially in changeable conditions like we saw yesterday in qualifying. You are ending up at high speed in a concrete wall. So it's one of those circuits which does test the driver's accuracy, well, the reliability of the car, the accuracy of the driver getting his braking zones right, his marker points where he's going to get on the wet line, the dry line. If you are going to get an overtake, getting that right. It is one of those ones where there's very little margin for error. It's an accuracy kind of circuit, and this is where a driver who's just very consistent generally actually does quite well. We do get some surprise winners at Canada in the past, and there's been some high speed accidents. I remember Robert Kubica had a bad one. The Wall of Champions has taken out so many high profile drivers over the last 25 years. Um, there have been some high speed incidents at Montreal. I mean, Olivier Panis broke both his legs there in 2001. So there has been some very high speed accidents. But at the same time, it's a very interesting circuit because it is so tight but so high speed. It is the complete opposite to Monaco. It's a high speed street circuit where you are on the throttle quite a bit, but you have to be accurate. So if you're just slightly offline going into a braking zone, you are in the wall in places, or you're running wide and you may lose 2 or 3 positions. And it's very difficult to get back on the racing line, the preferred racing line. But if there are changeable conditions, that completely changes the dynamic of the race. Um, it's a good thing that all 3 North American teams have got. Yes, I think it is. I think it's a good statement. I think Canada can definitely build, and they've had issues obviously with the players' strike recently in regards to contracts, be it commercial and developmental contracts and pay contracts that the Federation in Canada has signed. And So and that is a very interesting subplot going into this World Cup and then the next World Cup is there is a bit of breakdown between the governing body and the players within the Canadian setup. The Mexicans always qualify, so that's a given. It's a given from the Mexicans. But the US failing to qualify at the last tournament, qualifying for this one is important. Um, very, very important. The MLS since the last World Cup has expanded further. Um, so the league is going from strength to strength. People are going, but it could water down the product. Da, 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 da." I think it adds to it because it makes it a more open competition. There is a salary cap in place, so um, that has an impact. Raul Jimenez, I think the Mexican style, and I do say this, and I like the way the Mexicans play the game. Um, the Mexican style is completely different to the US, and I haven't seen how the Canadians play. They won they topped their qualifying group, qualified by right, so there is that to bear in mind. They were the best team over the last couple of years in the North American qualifying and North and Central American qualifying. Raul Jimenez. Mexico has consistently produced world class players over the last 50 years. Um, some of the best Mexican talent has played in Europe, to a very very high standard. I would say this: I haven't probably seen enough of the Mexicans in the last 4 years to pass comment on their style or how important Raul Jimenez is to the side. Um, in recent years, there are less high quality Mexicans playing in Europe. That doesn't mean that this isn't a high quality, technical, skillful side, um, because they are. There is no doubt on the style of football the Mexicans will be playing. And I do think this is a big chance with the conditions that will be played in Qatar. Um, it may benefit the Mexican uh, style of play. Looking at how those two playoff qualifiers were played, the Australia qualifier against Peru, the heat obviously clearly had an impact, uh, and the pace of the game went off a cliff in the second half. Whereas in the New Zealand Costa Rica game, the pace they just were on it for the 90 minutes. Now, whether it cooled down quicker in the second game or was slightly cooler is moot point because at both kickoffs it was over 30 degrees at 9 p.m. Now, in the 30 degrees Celsius, so convert that to Fahrenheit, that's completely different. But it was 30 degrees Celsius at kickoff, which in Fahrenheit I think it's in the 90s Fahrenheit, something like that. And on Friday, it hit, I think, at one point 34.5 degrees Celsius, which is in the high 90s, low hundreds Fahrenheit. I'm going by guesswork, so I don't know how the Celsius to Fahrenheit scale conversion rate goes, but I will check on that. Um, Lots of notifications. But and working in that was brutal. Um, uh, and that was just for one day. If you've got a whole tournament where you've got to have evening kickoffs, and even in the evening, it's still in the high 20s, low 30s Celsius, which is in the 90s to 100 Fahrenheit range, at 9 p.m., it's going to have an impact. Um, I think that will actually possibly suit the Mexican players, possibly. I think I think all three of the North American nations will possibly benefit from the tournament being played in November, December because of the MLS season being a summer league over in the US and Canada. I think that, in my opinion, does benefit them. I think their players will be fresher. I think their players will be more rested. Um, in regards to it being Mexico's favourite sport, I think so. I think boxing is quite popular in Mexico as well. Motorsport is quite popular in Mexico. There's a lot of motor racing drivers have come out of Mexico over the years, gone into NASCAR and F1 and IndyCar and other racing formats. Mexico's an interesting country. It is very, very interesting. But boxing is also very, very popular, and a lot of baseball players come from Latin America. So Mexico and baseball is a bit of a relationship there as well. But their most successful team is obviously the football team. Now, reading to that, if it's their favourite sport or not. But I'm aware that boxing is quite popular in Mexico as well. But Mexico is a very, very interesting country because of its vast size for one, and its very diverse population. Um, but yes, there's a reason why they hosted the Football World Cup twice in the space of 16 years. That tells all you need to know about the popularity of the sport in Mexico. And then Latin America, all the way from Mexico down to Argentina and Chile. Um, it, Football is religion. To you know, 2/3 of the Americas, is an absolute religion in some countries. And there are other very popular sports in Central and South America, but from all the way from Argentina and Chile at the bottom to Mexico at the top of Latin America, football is it is a very, very, very popular sport. Baseball is also very, very popular though in Latin America. So the fact that Costa Rica has made it to the World Cup is very, very important. The fact that Panama 4 years ago made it to the World Cup is also very, very important because baseball is also very highly popular in those locations. So for uh, what is actually classed as the secondary sport in those countries to make major tournaments is exceptionally important. Um, but there you go. Liga MX was easy to follow. I don't understand that playoff structure. Again, I Mexican football at league level doesn't get a lot of viewership over here in Europe when it comes to TV and media rights. I have looked at their playoff format; it is ridiculous. That is up to the Mexican FA and the Liga MX, their governing body. That's how they've decided to format their and structure their league. Whether you agree with it or not, there's no perfect system. Uh, I honestly believe in just a standard regular season. Top wins, bottom relegated, that kind of thing. But that's me from a European point of view. Um, Obviously, you've got the North American style playoff formats with like the NHL and Major League Baseball and the NBA and the NFL and such, where you have regular season and then you qualify for a postseason. Um, it's just how their league has decided to structure their season and postseason. It, it is overly complicated, but that's how their league has decided to organise and structure their competition. Now, a lot of North Americans following our leagues, when they really get into it and actually understand the promotion relegation concept, find it alien to begin with. I suppose if you watch it enough and you follow it enough, it sort of makes sense after a while. The, their scores were always on the bottom line of Sports Centre as a kid. Now it's been replaced by MLS. There you go. The MLS has obviously grown as a league and as a product, and therefore as a byproduct is getting more attention. Um, Also, I think partly to do with that more attention of the MLS is the obsession with European leagues and the fact that high-profile European players have consistently, since David Beckham, been coming over to the MLS to either finish out their careers or have a stint in North American football before either going back to European football or winding down their careers. So you've had David Beckham, you've had Andrea Pirlo, you've had Kaká, you've had Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard. Um, you're going to have Chiellini coming over, and these are just a handful of the players. There are more. Who are Ibrahimovic, for example, another one, and that's assisted in growing the product in the US and Canada massively, massively. And I think another reason why the 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 Liga MX is now probably lower down on the ticker tape is there's been obviously the political side of things of the US over the last few years with some of your presidents who will remain unnamed and their foreign policy and their rhetoric in regards to the Mexican people and the nation of Mexico over various issues that impacts what the broadcasters will broadcast. And also, it's the amount of money. It's like the MLS will as it is growing as a product, and there are large amounts of fans going to games now. And with the US obviously gaining another World Cup, it would be pretty suicidal not to promote your domestic league, considering the success of that domestic league and growth, viewership figures being up, the domestic fan base wanting that kind of content. Um, it, it it would be amiss not to um, promote and sell that product to your domestic and overseas audience. I mean, MLS games are shown over here. I mean, they're on a minor broadcaster, but they are shown over here in the UK. So it is reaching that wider global audience now. And as you say, viewership figures were up 17% year on year. So there is that growth already there. Now, whether COVID's had a positive or negative impact on that, and with expansion having a positive, negative impact on that, and therefore skewing the results slightly, it still tells you that viewership figures are up per 100,000 people. And therefore there is an upward trend of growth in viewership, attendance, merchandise sales, etc., with the league. And when you've got high-profile players globally coming to play a season, 2 seasons, 3 seasons, maybe retire out here, in your Ibrahimovic and David Beckhams and Pirlo's and Kaká's, for example, that helps sell the product massively. When you've got global superstars going, I'm going to play here for a season or two. Well, that's why I'm surprised Messi and Ronaldo haven't looked at the MLS to wind down their careers. It hasn't really worked towards the last couple of seasons. But again, you can definitely see a trend in the fact that the Mexican league isn't being as heavily pushed on the sports center or on the the scheduling. That obviously has an impact on when you're selling your TV rights. Now, whether the Mexican league went, you know what, we're going to focus our TV rights on Latin America to sell our product or our domestic audience. Maybe in the next 4 years that changes with the fact that they're co-hosting the tournament with the US and Canada. Maybe that changes and there's a more North and Central American kind of TV rights deal with the MLS and the Mexican league collaborate to sort out a better TV deal for both leagues that promotes and benefits and pushes the product to a wider audience in build up for this World Cup. And hopefully, three nations have a very good um, World Cup this year to also help boost the quality of the product that they can sell domestically and overseas. I don't know why Ronaldo is and Messi. I mean, PSG have got their own issues. They basically said to Pochettino, bye bye. So they haven't got a manager at the moment for PSG. The Ronaldo situation, again, I'm really surprised they didn't do what other players have done and have a look at the MLS even for a season or two just to you know wind things down. Still stay physically fit, still play. Um, that does surprise me somewhat. Um, Considering the other world class players that have gone before them to play in the MLS in the last 15 years. The situation at Manchester United with Eric Ten Hag as the new manager and the clear out and players leaving and such. It, yeah, there's it all depends on what his agent can get him really. I think the move to Manchester United has not been a success. You could also argue Messi's move to PSG hasn't really uh, given the rewards that the PSG board were looking for. Manchester United has been um, a mess since 2013. Um, PSG, the fact that no manager under the current ownership has won the Champions League tells you all you need to know about the culture within PSG and the damage that their unlimited wealth has done to the French game. Seattle Sounders, yes, they did win the CONCACAF Champions League. Um, well, if they are catching up to the Mexican League and they've obviously clearly overtaken the other Central American leagues as well. Um, it shows how strong the MLS product is right now, and how it has developed, which is a positive ultimately for the Canadian and US national sides, and the fact that Montreal again that's another added positive to the Canadian side, um, shows the development that league has taken in recent seasons. You know, looking at the history of the MLS, and I've done videos on the MLS, and I have to continue to look at the MLS and the history of teams and the struggles the MLS has been through, because it wasn't all plain sailing. There were concerns that the league may fold at various points in the 90s and the 2000s, and then David Beckham ends up playing at LA Galaxy, and the rest is history. Do I think Ottawa can get an MLS team anytime soon? I think it's more likely that another team goes into the western side of Canada. I think we'd possibly balance it out a little bit, but you've got quite a few cities west of Toronto, that you could hypothetically, in theory, place a team like Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Ottawa. It all depends on what the locals want, really. There is a need, or a want, I think is the better word. If there is actually a demand from people in the Ottawa metropolitan area for an MLS franchise. Um, is there enough disposable income in the surrounding area? Is there enough infrastructure? Is there enough grassroots level, recreational league kind of play being played? Or are there enough kids at school wanting to play the game? Because yes, while you have Toronto's a sports mad city, and that is the hub of Canadian soccer. Yes, I will call it that for this particular moment. Um, One of my old schools I went to used to do a summer tour to Toronto, and play a six was it a 6 or 3 week tournament. They would go over for a tournament over in Toronto for a couple of weeks, and this is 20 odd years ago. This is back in 2000 2003. There was always a summer tour that our school went on to play an age grade tournament in Toronto. Many years ago, we're talking over 20 years ago. So for a very, very long time, Toronto has been the hub of the sport in Canada. So Ottawa being in Ontario, it's possible, but why leave it so late in comparison to the fact that the sport is centered around Toronto and Ottawa is further up, Ontario. It's plausible, as I say. I think it's doable. I'm going to turn this light off because it's too warm in here. That's better. Now I can see. Now I can see. It's just too warm in here with the light on. Look, it's as I say, it's definitely feasible that Ottawa can get one. Um, and with the progress that the national side has made, and the fact that Canada are hosting a World Cup, it could be a good legacy to plonk a team in Ottawa. You know, the US have a team in DC. It would make logical sense to put a team in Ottawa and have a capital derby kind of thing, a capital rivalry. St. Louis and Vegas, again, with these teams joining, I am surprised the organisers of the tournament didn't decide to put more teams in what I call the Midwest, or those flyover states. Yes, you could argue the Texas locations in Houston and Dallas are on that time zone, but I am surprised that um, with Vegas and St. Louis establishing teams in the MLS in the next cycle, that I'm not trying to build on that. Same with Chicago not having a team. I'm really surprised that Chicago doesn't have any matches in the upcoming World Cup in 4 years' time. That would be a prime opportunity to again grow, and it's a big metropolitan area to grow the sport in that part of the world. Um, but the organisers have gone with the stadiums they've listed. It's 3 countries that have got to liaise together in order to organise this tournament. And this is why co-hosting is such a rare thing when it comes to tournaments. And you could argue, is it a good thing to have co-hosting? Is it a bad thing? Could the US have done it by itself, for example? Um, and I would say yes. I would say yes. The US could have definitely hosted the 2026 World Cup on its own. Um, it's going to be an interesting tournament with the fact it's expanded. Now, that decision to expand the World Cup format to 48 countries has been heavily, heavily criticised since the announcement was made. Um, and there are plenty of reasons for that criticism. And I can look at the reason. I can't. I personally think 32 is the highest number of teams in a World Cup tournament you can get away with having. Um, I think it works rather well having that 32 team format. Um, but if you look at the history of the FIFA World Cup, it is every, I think, 3 to 4 World Cups, there's always an expansion to the format or a change to the format. And FIFA have decided to expand it further. Um, it means more games are going to get played, and more nations. We're going to see some more debutants at the World Cup in 4 years' time, which will be fantastic. I'm not arguing against those countries that do qualify, but it does mean that there's going to have to be a change to the qualification processes again. We're going to see more of these intercontinental playoffs to make the World Cup in 4 years' time, which I'm not. Do group stage games? No, they vary on location. You will find that teams will have their training bases for the group stage, and you may have several nations occupy a training base location or a city as using that as a training base. So we don't know who's obviously qualified for this tournament yet. It's 4 years away. But if you look at um, the Euros, for example, that just passed, if you look at the Russia World Cup that we had in 2018, which was over a vast area, very similar to what we're going to see in this US, Canada, Mexico tournament, and in Brazil as well. Countries would choose training hubs and their hub locations. So you may have 3 or 4 countries in a city using that as their hub and using various training and media facilities and possibly even sharing. They might be in different groups, but sharing facilities. Group stage games. I personally believe when you're getting to a tournament this size, travel does become an issue. And what we saw in Russia is the climate became an issue because of the vastness of the country. And same with Brazil. When games were in Manaus, which is in the bloody Amazon for Christ's sake, and there were games in Sao Paulo and Rio, right near the Argentine border, which were 20 degrees cooler at some points. The climatic conditions did have an impact. Same with the Russia. The time zones had an impact. So when you have a country this large like the US and Canada, you've got 3 or 4 time zones covering a continent wide. You've got Toronto over here and Vancouver over here, for example. Again, travel. So I do think this World Cup we're going to have more, groups in one area. Like we may see Texas and Atlanta, for example, may have a group. Mexico may have a group or 2 groups based in Mexico, a couple of groups based in California and then the West Coast. We could see more regional groupings, but there isn't always one host city for one group. No. They will try and keep them as close as. It's difficult to describe the geographical workings out of things, but because it's such a vast tournament in the sense it's covering 3 massive countries um, and 16 cities. Um, it's a mad one. I mean, 2 cities may cover a group basically, so I think if they continue with the 8 group format, I don't think they will, but if they do, hypothetically, one group could be covered by 2 locations. So you, in theory, could have 2 groups in the World Cup. But let's say A and B based in Mexico. You can have Group C based in Canada, for example, because there's 2 cities. or the Pacific Northwest. You could have a whole group based in California. You could have a group based in Texas. So you could do it by geographical location rather than just one particular city. But I think it's going to be. I think travel is going to be interesting. I think the way the organisers are going to have to organise the tournament's going to be interesting, and it's going to be the team that deals best with the heat. The altitude of Mexico, for example, could have an impact, and the travel is going to win that World Cup in 4 years' time. It's like the tournament this winter. It's the team that deals with the conditions best that wins, and we could see some um, massive upsets in this tournament. I think we're going to see some unexpected results, and I think we're going to see some lesser nations go further in the tournament than expected. But there's only one debutant nation in this year's World Cup, which is the host. So it's a much more competitive World Cup than in previous editions, with only that one debutant nation. It's a difficult one to really predict what's going to happen. But looking at those two playoff matches that I watched, the conditions did have an impact on the pace of the game. Decision making, mistakes. There was a lot of mistakes in both games because both sides were pretty evenly balanced in regards to the quality that they. I mean, look at New Zealand's ranking to Costa Rica's. That's a flawed ranking because they play in Oceania. If New Zealand, alongside Australia, were to both go into the Asian qualification process, New Zealand would be ranked higher. So that was a very tight game. I think New Zealand played better in that game. Australia, Peru, very few shots on target, which was both games were different, but I think the conditions. I think both Peru and Australia didn't adapt to the conditions as well as New Zealand and um, Costa Rica. Whether that's they spent less time out in Qatar or they had a more disruptive preparation or bringing players in from all over the world, um, the outcome of those games were very, very different. But goal scoring was one goal in 2 games. Was not expecting that. Um, do I think there's any boys from the mountains? Mountains in New Zealand aren't that high. They're very similar height to the Alps. They're not as high as the Rockies or the Andes or the Sierra Nevadas. Uh, most of the players come from the North Island, which is lower in altitude, which has lower mountains, Auckland and Wellington. Um, but I've got family in New Zealand, and New Zealand is you've got a narrow coastal strip and then mountains, so it's very limited for where you can actually build settlements. Very small. The South Island's got a tiny population in comparison. The North Island's got the majority of the population, and that's where the majority of professional sportsmen come from is the Auckland, Wellington metropolitan areas, the two big cities down on the North Island. Um, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, yeah, they were born in what they call Southern Alps. Yeah, but New Zealand's a very interesting country because you've got subtropical north to very, very cold South Island, which is bloody freezing in winter. Um, but there could be some of the team could have played or been brought up in the mountains as kids. It's not without the realms of possibility that's happened. And then for whatever reason, their families have ended up in Auckland or in Wellington, which are coastal cities, or Invercargill or Hamilton or one of the coastal cities. But the majority of the population in New Zealand comes from Auckland and Wellington and the North Island. The South Island, the settlements are more spread out and they're smaller in size. Um, but New Zealand, again, the Rugby World Cup in 2011, that was a very interesting tournament because it took place in New Zealand Springs, which took place at a weird time of year for the climate in New Zealand. It took place at a weird time of year, and it was a fantastic tournament. It was a fantastic tournament. I remember, um, and the backdrop of some of the stadiums was fantastic in New Zealand. Absolutely fantastic. The backdrop and the the landscape. It's a fantastic country with some great geology and geography, and it's a fantastic location to play sport. Um, and but yeah, the majority of professional athletes in New Zealand come from Auckland or Wellington, the two biggest cities in the North Island. Although there are some sport, some rugby players and rugby league players from the South Island, and some football players from the South Island. Um, the main population base is the North Island, so um, that is that really in that context. But yeah, as I say, people obviously move around. People's parents change jobs, and so it's not without the realms of possibilities that a young kid growing up on the South Island, his family moved to Auckland for work, and he ends up playing for the New Zealand national side. Um, yes, you do have the Santa Clara Mountains, and you have the Sierra. Is it the Sierra Nevadas, the base of the Rockies? Satellite ranges. I'm not. You have the coastal mountains. The Los Angeles the Los Angeles metropolitan area. You've got the Santa Clara Mountains, and you've got the Sierra Nevadas, parts of them, and the base of the Rocky chain. And California is just mountains, really, with river valleys. And then, yeah, then you've got obviously the Appalachians over on the East Coast, and there's some fantastic backdrops. Uh, you know, Vegas, for example, is you can see the mountains because it's so flat, and then you have these mountains in the background. It's a fantastic. Seattle, Vancouver, with these, there are some fantastic backdrops to locations around the world. Some fantastic stadium backdrops, and they're amazing. And in 4 years' time, in the World Cup, especially the games in Mexico, in like Mexico City and Guadalajara, Monterrey, there are some fantastic backdrops. Are you know through the high Sierra Nevadas, and you've got some active volcanoes as well, just to add to the mix, which could explode, which is amazing. But no, I'm really looking forward to the 4 years' time. I think the quality of football we'll see in 4 years' time will be higher than the quality we see at Qatar. But I hope the quality of football surprises us, quite frankly, because with what I haven't even mentioned the Gareth Southgate situation and whether his job's under pressure. I did a poll on the channel like, is Gareth Southgate going to get sacked for the World Cup? And most people say no, but in the comment section of that post, they're like, we wish he was, but there's no one to replace him. I don't even know who the coaches of the US national side, to be fair. The days of Jurgen Klinsmann are long gone. But if it wasn't for Jurgen Klinsmann, you do not have the structures in place at the USA Soccer. If it wasn't for Jurgen Klinsmann and his involvement post coaching Germany, Jurgen Klinsmann, as I say, if it wasn't for his involvement in coaching and the administration side and the development side of the game, you don't have the quite. I'm actually have to put this light back on because I can't really see. That's better. Now you can see my face. Um, yeah, without Jurgen Klinsmann, in his period as head coach and then his role within US Soccer, you don't have the structures you have in place ultimately today. So there are some positives to having an overseas coach. Greg Berhalter, God, that's a Berhalter. Oh, let's have a look at it. Let's have a look at his profile because there have been some good coaches who coached the US, but as I say, if it wasn't for Jurgen Klinsmann's period in charge, don't have. All right, let's have a look at what comes up on his profile. Let's just go to. Yep, read that. The United States. Greg. Wow. Greg Berhalter. Oh, he's actually American. That's okay. So they've gone with the domestic coach, and my phone has decided to go bleh and be slow. Yeah, he's a former player. He previously coached the Columbus Crew and Hammarby in Sweden. and he was an assistant coach at LA Galaxy. Okay, so he's not completely um, uh, hopeless. He played a lot of time in Holland. He played a lot of time in Holland. He played in Zwolle, Sparta Rotterdam. He's played for Crystal Palace in England. Huh. He played in Germany for Energy Cottbus, 1860 Munich, and he finished his career at LA Galaxy. Okay. His managerial side of things, LA Galaxy, he was an assistant in 2011. 2011, 2013, he was coaching Hammarby in Sweden, who are a big club in Sweden, by the way. And then he came back to coach the Columbus Crew for 5 years. And then he's obviously been the head coach of the US since 2018 after their failure to qualify for the World Cup. So they've given him a lot of time to get things fixed with the United States. So he took over the head coaching role on December the 2nd, 2018. He earned his first victory as coach in a friendly against Panama in 2019. He coached the Continental Championship at the CONCACAF Gold Cup, which is important, and got them to qualify for the World Cup. So he's had a decent time in charge. I think that's important, giving a coach a good period of time, and they give him a World Cup cycle to improve the situation, which he has done. But as I say, the structures put in place by Jurgen Klinsmann are serving United States soccer well today. There's no doubt on that. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind the structures that were put in place by Jurgen Klinsmann have definitely benefited the national side of the US up to this present point. Admittedly, there's that one World Cup don't qualify for in 2018, but Jurgen Klinsmann has always been very, very keen on the structures put in place, the youth development. Don't get Christian Pulisic scouted and kept for the US. He may have gone, I think he's Croatian or Serbian by origin. You could have lost Christian Pulisic, for example, to a European nation by parentage. The fact that Klinsmann has put those structures in place and improved the working relationship between the national side and the MLS has definitely benefited where the men's national side is. Now, the debate in the US is the women's team is more successful, which it is. For whatever reason, that is the case. I am surprised with the amount of money in US sport they haven't taken, football, our football, more seriously as things go. It's taken them a long time to get a better professional league in place, which is now the MLS. Um, I'm just surprised it's taken it this long um, to be where they are. Um, and with the money available and the money within the game, I'm really really surprised by the lethargic nature of the growth. Until recently in the sport in the US and Canada, I'm really surprised with what I call the lethargic growth. Um, I can understand some of the obstacles in place with the NFL and Major League Baseball and the NHL being the really dominant, and the NBA being the dominant for sports leagues in the US and Canada, but I'm very, very surprised. Uh, in high school and college, they count down the clock instead of counting up. It makes you want to throw. Again, it's because they've got their scoreboards, which they would normally have for American football or baseball or the other sports that they play. It's how the scoreboards are set up. I think it's just the Americans like things differently and play. They invented everything. Um, it is frustrating. I'm not. Well, when you watch North American sport as a European, you know that's their uniqueness, so to speak. Um, but you just get used to if you it, sometimes yeah. I don't know why the Americans do that. They do, but I don't know why. But as a European, watching enough North American sport over my time as well, you get used to um, it after a while. It does take time. It does take time. Um, but if you've been buying into the European product as a North American, you see how differently we do it, and then you look how the American, the US do it. It's like, why are you being so resistant to positive changes you could learn from another country or another system. Um, Again, this is where I've described the cultural and sporting differences between North America, predominantly the US and Europe, and I've done videos on it. And you know, there are some of the North American sports culture or sporting ways of doing things are very, very alien um, to the European sports market. Um, and there's there's been discussions about implementing a draft kind of system into the NRL in Australia, or bringing in US style, and when I say US style, salary caps to European sport. Well, we do have salary caps over here in certain sports, but they are dealt with and structured completely differently to the US system, for example, where you have a soft cap or a luxury tax or a hard cap. The the salary cap systems we do have in place within certain sports are far different in structure to the the US system of salary cap. We put more emphasis on, as I say, the local club or the local community developing talent, the local club or clubs picking up that youth talent and developing that talent through their youth systems to make the senior team. Whereas in the US, you have the junior leagues, a draft system, collegiate system, if you will, the NCAA or the junior league system, then a draft system, then the major leagues. So your system of developing talent is not from purely grassroots through one team developing through a system. It's get a youth league or a collegiate system or a minor league to develop our talent, then we get to pick the best. Well, what kind of? Well, it would be more similar to the Major League Baseball luxury tax, I would have thought, based upon revenues and expenditure. It's basically we'll have to see what UEFA implements with their new spending policies. It's meant to be a scaled system, so you have 3 or 4 years to implement um, your uh, basically spending cap. Uh, UEFA are proposing a new salary cap type system without the word cap being used. It's more of a financial luxury tax um, style system they're trying to implement, um, and it's been discussed for quite some time. This is not something that's a brand new discussion that this has never happened before. The idea has been on the table for years as a proposal. And what we currently have in the English Premier League and the French League One or League 1, as it's called, and La Liga and Serie A and the Bundesliga, um, is various forms of financial fair play. Now, the Bundesliga, I believe, has the best spending rules in place, the best financial rules in place. They're not perfect. And then you look at the Eredivisie, for example, in Holland, and you look at the Bundesliga in Austria, and then go and all these other leagues. None of them have a salary cap. None of them have a spending cap. They have to work under the principle of financial fair play. And then there are other derivative rules that domestic leagues, such as the English FA, brought in with the 135% losses over profits margin rule, which, if they were to properly implement that, 70 clubs straight away would be fined and docked points. It'd be highly embarrassing. And this is where the weak governance, I think, in my opinion, has contributed to the Derby County situation, to the situation with Birmingham City and Reading in the Championship, to the issues with Everton now seeking outside investment from Peter Kenyon. Bad ownership, for example, you've got clubs that have been badly run, have fallen out of the Football League, a whole host of other issues like Portsmouth and things like that. I'll get to that in more club history videos. I'll do the Derby County video next, which will probably be later today. So at the moment, it will be very, very difficult to establish one. However, the lower leagues in English football, League One and League Two, especially, about just over a year and a half ago, December 2020. So COVID, the next wave has hit. No fans allowed in attendance. Games being cancelled all over the place. The lower league struggling with lack of attendance, reduced attendance. And League One and League Two clubs unanimously, that's 48 clubs went, hold on, we need a salary cap. We need to control this um, expenditure. We cannot currently survive with the current structures in place. It's unsustainable. There was a rescue package organised, but it only involved the Championship. The Championship clubs also en masse joined their League One and League Two brethren in the Football League and say, no, if you have this spending um, revenue sharing the TV, which it basically is, you have to include all three of the Football League leagues, not just one. We will reject this deal, which made the Premier League look very, very stupid, made the FA look weak. And unfortunately, in recent years, it's been a handful of Premier League clubs that have resisted positive changes. And you can guess the handful of 6 or 7 Premier League clubs that continue to be obstacles in the way of um, bringing in the fan-led review, the independent governing body, review body, um, bringing in a salary cap. It's a handful of clubs that regularly resist um, bringing in positive implementation of changes that would benefit all. Um, Ironically, the clubs would actually make more money, be even more profitable than they are now, but for some reason, the owners and the club chairman are being resistant to developing a fairer financial system, a more balanced financial system, a system that actually protects all clubs because it would stop bad ownership getting away with what they get away with. Um, some of the takeovers have been questionable over the last 18 to 20 years. Um, the directors' test doesn't work because you get bad. They don't regularly audit clubs for their, how healthy are clubs' finances, how healthy are how you know how things are going. Are they profitable? Are there issues? Um, so we've seen a whole host of problems in regards to football finance. Um, the whole financial side of the game is a mess. It's not just an English problem. Europe-wide, the structures are all over the place. I don't think UEFA with their UEFA coefficient has helped the situation by basically funneling the money into a handful of leagues and a handful of clubs. There is the breakdown in trust between top clubs um, uh, uh, and uh, and the governing body. Is there a typical style of play? Ooh, well, we've got the Ajax style of total football, which obviously the Dutch national side implemented between 74 and 78, got to 2 World Cup finals and lost. The Dutch historical style is basically a 4-3-3. The total football style from Ajax and the Dutch side of the 70s with Cruyff and Neeskens and co. Is very, very interesting. It's a hybrid variation on the 4-3-3. You have a high press, high energy press, and your wing back could also end up as a centre forward in various forms of attacking play. Um, it also relies on players being interchangeable in position and being able to play multiple positions, which doesn't always work. So while that has been, attempted, the Dutch tried it, and Ajax were very, very successful in European club football. On the international stage, Holland didn't win their first European title until 1988. So they took the Dutch style is always a high press 4-3-3 is the most effective Dutch style. That's what Dutch fans want to see. They want to see fast paced attacking, football. Um, the Dutch have always produced quality talent. They've always had quality players coming through. Um, and you've got some big Dutch clubs other than Ajax. You've got PSV, you've got Feyenoord, AZ Alkmaar. Um, there are some other big Dutch clubs, but the style of football is generally high press, high defensive line, and it relies on the Dutch players playing a very interchangeable style of play. So your centre back can go on a driving run and end up as a centre attacking midfielder. The more central midfielder will drop back as like a sweeper centre back to cover that. So defensively, you when a player goes on a run or makes an attacking play, another player would also learn that player's position and drop in to cover that attacking play. It's called total football. It was reasonably successful at club level for a 3 4 year period, and then it failed internationally. Sort of similar to the tiki-taki football that Spain played, in a sense that that was the dominant style for a period, but it was ultimately flawed. While it won a title here or there, and in international football pretty dominant, it ultimately was a flawed style of football that actually is quite easily shut down. Um, at the time, coaches were just like, "Oh, they're passing us to death." It's actually very, very easy to shut down. You just shut down the passing channels and you cut off the attacking midfielder. Cut off the attacking midfielder because they play with a false nine. So they don't play with a centre forward. You reduce their output. So the tiki taki is actually very easy to shut down. The Dutch total football was very easy to break down because defensively it is a flawed system, very, very flawed system. Because it only works properly if every player buys into the system. So at international level, it doesn't work. At club level, it does. International level, it doesn't because it requires every single club in the league to play the same style, which is never going to happen. Um, and it does rely on attacking sense, players interchanging positions. So when a player does do a driving run or makes a run off the ball, another player will slot into his position should the play turn over, but that then leads to defensive confusion and doesn't necessarily work. But it relies on all outfield players being equally skilled as well and technical ability, which you can't always get. There's nothing wrong with a centre back putting the ball into row Z. I like that. Sometimes I just like a centre back who's just physical and clears the ball. That's their job. So would I ever do a PSV? Absolutely. I've got to go through the Dutch league, the Eredivisie. There's some great clubs in there. REC Breda, Utrecht, Sparta Rotterdam. There's loads of clubs. It's not just the Ajax Feyenoord PSV show. You've got other clubs who are also pretty good in Dutch football that needs looking at. But yes, I can definitely look at PSV Eindhoven. Haven't been successful for a while, in the sense they haven't been as successful as they were in the 80s and 90s. They have declined somewhat. Doesn't mean they've completely declined, but they have declined somewhat. Feyenoord have been a very historically successful side. Ajax, obviously, but then you've got Sparta Rotterdam. You have REC Breda and Utrecht. There are other AZ Alkmaar. There are other clubs in Dutch football that have also been at the top at various points. Just so happens that Ajax, Feyenoord, and PSV are the most recognisable names in Dutch football. There are some other pretty. Groningen, for example, is another club. There's some other pretty decent clubs in Dutch football with some pretty decent histories that are overshadowed by a handful of clubs that get all the attention. Much like in England, we have the Big Six conversation. There are other clubs that are very, very successful that have achieved things within the game, and at various points, it's the same in the Spanish league with the Big Three, or Big Five, if you want to class those clubs that have never been relegated from the top flight as well for success. Yeah, it distorts it distorts the knowledge or the what's going on. It does distort it, and there are multiple clubs that I think, in my opinion, get undervalued for what they have done for the history of the game. But yes, I can look at some Dutch clubs at various points. I was born near Holland, actually. I wasn't born that far away from the Dutch border in Germany. So the third best, well, historically, I would argue it's Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and then Chile would be that order. I think Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay, I think, are far and away ahead of the other nations. Make of that what you will. I think Chile are a very, very good side historically. They just haven't qualified for as many World Cups as they should have. Colombia and Ecuador have underachieved, and Peru have just not been good enough for a very, very long time. and then Bolivia and Venezuela. And Paraguay have also failed to. Paraguay is an interesting one because they've had some good sides over their time, but they've failed to push on. It's Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay for me are the top three. Chile are behind them, um, and then you've got Ecuador and Ecuador's, I think, the next best. There you go. Because the other side, like Paraguay, Bolivia, Venezuela, and Colombia, especially Colombia, is really frustrating. They've really frustrated me in recent years since 2014. They've really underachieved for the quality and the talent that they have available to them. Over the years, in my lifetime, they've had some brilliant, like Valderrama, um, for example, as in that midfield, was one of the best midfielders of his generation. Um, James Rodriguez has underachieved since 2014. Um, they have had some outstanding players with technical ability, speed, physicality, vision, fitness levels, you name it, they've had it. And they just don't reach the levels that they should do. Colombia is not as small as Ecuador. Ecuador was tiny compared to Colombia, but Colombia, obviously, the social issues in Colombia over the last, what, 40, 50 years, and political violence and the social ills that Colombia has have definitely impacted the ability of the country to continue to develop the quality talent that we have seen over the last 32 years, um, from Valderrama and Rene Higuita all the way through to James Rodriguez now. They have consistently produced talented players. Unfortunately, I think the social ills that the country has faced over the last 50, 60 years have impacted the development and the structures of the game in Colombia, which is saddening because Colombia has, in my opinion, always developed fantastic players who have gone on to do fantastic things within the international and especially even the European game. But I'm really surprised with James Rodriguez and his lack of pushing on since 2014. Um, but that happens with Real Madrid with players. It sometimes, well, a lot of the time, it causes Real Madrid. It doesn't work. It's the best way to describe Real Madrid. But he is an exceptionally talented football player. Um, Technically, he's a fantastic player. Um, you know, that goal he scored against Uruguay in 2014 was ridiculous. One of the best goals of the tournament. Um, but as I say, yes, he hasn't pushed on and kicked on and developed. Do I think Maradona was bawling out for Pablo Escobar when he played for Ibijel? Um, yeah, Maradona. Again, Maradona is a very, very interesting character, flawed character. There's no doubt on his ability on the field and what he could do. And people say, "Oh, Maradona single-handedly won the World Cup for Argentina in 1986." No, he didn't. You had Valderrama, not Valderrama. You had Burruchaga, um, and other key players who helped get them over the line in '86, and then that led on to the 1990 team, with some of the players that ended up coming through in the '90s for Argentina as well. It wasn't the Maradona show; it was he was the star player, but there were other supporting actors in '86. But Maradona, as a human being, was an exceptionally flawed character. A lot of his problems actually occurred when he was playing at Barcelona, and then later on at Napoli, before his spell in at Valencia. There were a lot of issues. And if you watch the documentary, it highlights a lot of those problems in regards to the issues that were faced, and a lot of his social demons that he was contending. There was no doubt Maradona was possibly the ultimately flawed genius, in my opinion. Ultimately flawed genius. Is he the greatest of all time? Probably not. Um, I think, is he the complete player? He was definitely he could take the physical punishment and dish out the physical punishment. You look at the 82 and 86 World Cups. Um, Obviously, the game has completely changed since the 80s in style of play and how you play it and the physicality of the game and the quality of the playing circuit. But the 82 World Cup, the Belgian and Italian teams kicked lumps out of him. They physically kicked him out of the game. So in '86, he gets more aggressive, and he gets far more aggressive in '86. And in the Spanish game as well, when he was playing for Barcelona against Athletic Bilbao, he started an ethnic riot. He started a riot between the Basques and the Catalans. Um, and he does kick the Bilbao goalkeeper unconscious in the head. So there is that. But he adapted his game where he became equally as physical and dirty, which is basically he stood up for himself. There's none of this rolling around like he's been shot. They were kicking the crap out of him. So he decided to kick the crap out of them back. The England game in the quarter final, the same tactic was employed. The Belgians in '86 in the semi final, the same tactic was employed. It just so happened that he had developed his game where he would bite back a bit more. Whereas in '82, he was a bit younger, a bit more naive, and they kicked lumps out of him. Best version of Maradona in '86. That's a good question. I think by that point, yes, you could argue that is when he's at the peak of his powers. But you can also already see the issues that are going to be affecting him in the next 10 years after that point. So he's developed his game where he can now tolerate the physical side of the abuse that he's going to get from European style defences. Because in South America, when he's playing at Boca, the game is different. Comes to Europe, they've already prepared for him and they've got that style that's been in place for 10, 15 years. You see a talented player, kick lumps out. They did it to Pele in '66. Um, South American talent, kick him off the field. That's basically the brutality of football back then. It was not even on the same. Now it's different. The game has completely evolved. You look at footage from the '60s, '70s, '80s, and into the '90s, it is completely different to what you see now. There is too much play acting in the game. Players are worked out. You pretend to be shot and roll around. You can get a physical, fair defender sent off, and so defenders now are less inclined to scythe you down, basically. Um, but I would say peak of his powers. Yeah, you could say it was I think his best performance is not against England. I think it's against Belgium in the semi-final. I think you get the best out of Maradona ever is the 1986 semi-final um, against Belgium. I think is a better Maradona. I think that is Maradona at his best. Um, After that, it's a slow decline, but then it becomes far more noticeable during his time at Napoli, and then it goes off a cliff very quickly after. Um, it's a complex one. I think his time at Barcelona didn't go to plan, and then you've got the spurt at Napoli and the '86 to '90 World Cups. I think his best ever game is the game against Belgium, in my opinion. A lot of people say his game against England, but no, I think the game against Belgium um, is his best ever performance, and possibly the best of Maradona. But that's a one-off game in a period of time in a time frame. I think the '86 semi-final against Belgium is the best we'll see out of Diego Maradona ever, in my personal opinion. But that's again subjective. The fact that I've actually rewatched these games. I mean, these games took place 3.5 years before I was born, but you can always find them on the internet. And rewatching all of his games at the '82 World Cup and all of his games at the '86 and the '90 World Cup. Obviously, he only played the one game at the '94 World Cup, but I remember it because he was playing against Greece. Why Napoli? It's an interesting one. Napoli, why go there? Um, Very interesting decision. The mafia has some involvement, by the way, and the mafia are linked to the cartels. So there you go. It is interesting why Napoli. Why not AC or Juventus or Inter or Roma or Lazio? Why Napoli? Why Southern Italy? Why that club? Why not another one of the Italian clubs? Why not another one of the big European clubs? I haven't actually seen the documentary. I'm gonna have to look at why. I'm gonna have to read into more and research more why Napoli was the chosen location for Diego Armando Maradona. I think he also has Italian heritage as well, so um, which is interesting. A lot of his Argentinian teammates ended up in Marseille. Another one. Um, Valdano and Burruchaga ended up in France. So it is interesting that uh, uh, Maradona ends up at Napoli. Very, very interesting. And not one of the other clubs in Italian football at the time. Um, that is an interesting one. That's bugged me since I was a kid because Napoli, again, it didn't happen overnight with Napoli winning the Scudetto a couple of times. It didn't happen. I mean, it took a bit of time. I think Napoli, much like Barcelona, it was a risk. There was risk attached to that, and obviously you have to bear in mind his time at Barcelona didn't go very well, personally at least. And then there was definite issues at Barcelona um, with 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 Maradona. Um, the Napoli one is very interesting because the team was a mid-table team, and yeah, Napoli at the time in Western Europe at least was not a wealthy city. It still isn't. I've been to Napoli or Naples as the anglicised version of the city's name. I've been to the Bay of Naples. I've been to Napoli, Napoli. I've been to the Neapolitan region. I've been to Campania. There are some areas in Campania that are actually like Sorrento and places like that actually are far more wealthy than Napoli. But Napoli as an urban area is very 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 poor. Um, even now there are still massive slums in Napoli. Um, the city centre is beautiful, but the city as a whole is a lot of rich and poor divide. Um, it, it it has the ability to be one of the wealthiest cities in the world. It's a massive port city, but yeah, it is an economically deprived area. And yeah, a reporter at the time did say that the poorest city in Europe has just brought the world's most expensive football player. Um, you could argue that, yes. I think it was one of the poorest cities in Western Europe at the time. And I've done videos on the History Channel on the Italian state and the North, the Maxi trials as well of the 80s and 90s, and that had something to do with the issues at the time. There were a lot of social problems in Italy at the time. It's called the Years of Lead. There was a lot of political violence, terrorist violence, you know. So there was a lot of things socially happening in Italy that obviously with the World Cup that was seen as the change, that was seen as a new decade. We're approaching the 21st century. And I've been to Italy a hell of a lot as a kid growing up. I've spent a lot of time there. Um, Southern Italy though is a different world. You have to visit it and compare it to Northern Italy, and you'll see what I mean when I say it's a different world. It's a different way of life. Why Napoli though? I don't know. He could have gone out to any club in Italy. He ends up at Napoli. The club transforms itself from a mid-table, middling team to one of the well, other top players went to Napoli. It wasn't just Maradona. They transformed their fortunes, and then USA '94 happens, and I think he's already left Napoli at this point. But USA '94 obviously is that goal against Greece and his subsequent failed drugs test. Um, if you watch the documentary, obviously the issues are surrounding Maradona with the drugs and the issues that he has. By USA '94, um, he's in serious trouble. Personally, his health is a mess. And then I remember in 1995, his drugs ban was lifted, and he was playing. He was going to play. He played for Valencia, I believe. Finished his career at Valencia, I believe, and in Europe at least. And there's a very famous quote from Paul Gascoigne when he's playing for Lazio in his ill-fated spell at Lazio. And again, why Gascoigne to Lazio? Why Maradona to Napoli? You couldn't make this up. But Paul Gascoigne was famously in the tunnel, and he'd been out on a heavy sesh. There's a very famous photo of them, at the end of the game swapping shirts. They're both absolutely off their tits. Gazza's been out on a drinking sesh with some of his team. He's been on the sauce, so to speak. Um, and Maradona's obviously been out on the gear and everything, and they're the two best players on the pitch. They're both completely and utterly off their, they're out of it. And that's a very famous photograph of them changing shirts at the end of the game, and famously Gaz was like alleged to have said, "Oh God, I hope we're going to be okay because I'm pissed. I've been out on the sauce." And Maradona goes back to, "Oh, don't worry, I've been on the gear all night." Very famously off the cuff quote. Um, what was the first Galacticos-esque player movement in European football? Well, the superstars go. I think you could argue breaking down of barriers where the South American players were allowed to move to Europe en masse in the 70s and the 80s, and they started to do so more as the 80s wore on. That was partly to do with the military dictatorships and the political situation in South America at the time. As the 70s and 80s wore on, like you get players like Batistuta, Crespo, the young Ronaldo, the original Ronaldo, the fat one, the nice one, Ronaldo Nazario. You get this influx of talent from South America. Obviously, a young Diego Forlan ends up at Man United in the early 2000s. Juan Pablo Veron, Ayala, Diego Simeone ends up playing in Europe. This influx of South American, Shivanton, another one, who's played for Uruguay, ends up, I think, at Lecce at the time. But these South American players end up en masse in the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s. They start funneling into Europe because there's a relaxation on overseas players being allowed to play. So Mario Kempes in the 70s was allowed to play for Valencia. He was one of the few Argentinians allowed to play in Europe at the time. And Diego Maradona, likewise, in when he went to Barcelona, was allowed to go. And then you obviously have the Falklands War, the collapse of the military junta. Socrates, he played one game he played one game at a non-league side in England before he died. I can't remember if Socrates actually played his professional. He played one game for Nantwich or something in some pub team, some real non-league team in England. Quite funny. Back before he died, but Socrates did play one game for an English club side. Yes, I think 2004, 2005. So before he died, he was very ill health at this point. Socrates was really in poor health by the time he played that one game. I'm gonna have a look at Socrates actually quickly. But Socrates in that Brazil side of the 80s. There was still not a lot of them had gone to Europe by this point. Brazilian club football was brilliant, fantastic at this point. But not a lot of them had decided to. Socrates. Let's have a look at he died in 2011. Socrates was a fantastic player. Though. There is no doubt on his ability and as an attacking midfielder. Socrates, Basiliario, Sampaio, de Souza Vieira, de Oliveira. Similar to Socrates, so his first name basically is, I'll just drop all my surnames. Um, yes, he did have a medical degree. He was politically he was a doctor. Right, so he played for Botafogo, Corinthians, Fiorentina. Yes, he did, and Garthorpe Town, but he played for Fiorentina for 2 seasons. He did play in Europe for Fiorentina for 25 games, and then he goes back to Brazil. So he played for Corinthians, comes to Fiorentina, plays at Flamengo and Santos, and he finished his career at Botafogo, Sao Paulo, and then he played for Garthorpe Town um, for 1 game. There you go. But he also managed Botafogo, Quito, Cabo Friense. He played 60 times for Brazil between 79 and 86. But yes, he played 1 season at Fiorentina. The rest of his professional career, he played in Brazil. So there you go. In the Sao Paulo area. So there you go. Socrates was the firstborn child of Raimundo and Guiomar Vieira. He was born in Belém, Para, and no, after he retired, he held a bachelor's degree in medicine, and whilst he was playing, he earned that degree. He was while he was playing football, he was studying to be a doctor, and then he practiced medicine. He was actually a doctor. He was also noted for being an intellectual, a heavy drinker, and a heavy chain smoker. His younger brother Rai was also a football player, attacking midfielder, being a member of the Brazilian team that won the World Cup in '94. So Socrates' little brother won the World Cup in '94. There you go. Rai Souza Vieira de Oliveira is a Brazilian football player who played as attacking midfielder, and he also played in Europe. He played for Botafogo, Ponte Preta, Sao Paulo, PSG, and went back to Sao Paulo. So yeah, his little brother won. Um, Socrates was vital in the democracy movement in Brazil against the ruling military government, and so yeah, in that. He's a very interesting man with Socrates, but yes, he did. He would say he would, and his younger brother would as well. Rai, Socrates and Rai, imagine them as a partnership. That'd be fantastic. But no, Socrates was a brilliant player. But the fact that while he was playing, he still got his medical degree is insane. And then after retiring, he practiced medicine. Let that sink in. My thoughts on the situation with Bassini and Birmingham City. I've covered Birmingham City. I've done the video obviously on Birmingham City's club history and their lack of success historically, which I find ridiculous considering that West Brom and Aston Villa having so much more success than them. But the situation at Birmingham, much like the situation at Derby and Portsmouth in the past and Sheffield Wednesday and other clubs, in my opinion, comes down to several things. The EFL's weak governance and the situation uh, in regards to Birmingham City is quite troubling. They're not quite at the stage of a Derby County, and their situation again is quite fraught with they could go out of business this summer, which would be very embarrassing for the EFL because that would be the third club failure in 3 years. And yes, you could argue COVID has had an impact on that, but if Derby County go out of business, that's Bury, Macclesfield, and Derby all going out of business in the space of 3 years, almost to the day. Would be catastrophic as a PR move, just on the PR of it, and that would be absolutely catastrophic, in my opinion, for all the football league, absolutely catastrophic, because it would erode the trust yet further in the system. So I am concerned about Birmingham City. That's my thoughts on it. Regardless who is interested in getting involved with the club, I have concerns about the situation at Birmingham City. And we've been here with Aston Villa being on the verge of administration 4 years ago. Um, it doesn't matter. Take the rivalry out of it. There is massive concerns for me with how the governance of the game has been run for so long. The finances of the sport are clearly in a very troubling situation, and you can't argue, you can't say, oh, it's all because COVID's the problem. No, the financial issues within club football have been present for the best part of 2, 3 decades and have been getting worse. And COVID exposed how badly run a lot of these clubs are, and the failure of the EFL to really govern the game and impose the financial fair play rules, the directors' rules, and the profit over loss rules. Because if they were to properly enforce their rules that they have, 70% of the clubs in English football, in the full professional divisions, from the Premier League down to League Two, would be in breach of those spending rules at some point, would be in breach of financial fair play at some point, and would be punished. Can't have that. So the Football League and the Premier League and the FA cherry pick the sides they want to punish and use them as examples. It doesn't really deter bad ownership because the director's test clearly is flawed. Um, and Bassini, I don't know enough about Bassini to pass comment on him personally and his practices, but the Birmingham City situation, in my opinion, is just as serious as Derby County's. It's just a step or two behind where Derby County are now. Um, and the fact that the Derby County takeover has collapsed and leaves the situation, well, very fraught, is deeply concerning. But then this time last year, Swindon nearly went out of business in the Football League. So it doesn't matter what level of the league pyramid you are. There is a massive, at this point, situation. Look, Sullivan and Gold. I mean, look, again, I'm not a massive fan of Sullivan and Gold at West Ham, and they've also previously had involvement with Birmingham City. There's been concerns throughout their time involved, and without, including Bassini as well, Bassini and Sullivan and Gold, throughout their time involved and their involvement in football. Throughout that time, there's been concerns over some of the tactics and practices they've used. But as I say, the situation at Birmingham is a mirror situation, I think, of the situation at Derby County and the situation that befell Bury and the situation that befell Macclesfield. It's weak governance to begin with that then allows the bad ownership to take place. Then the owners do what they want, rightly or wrongly, and then we end up down the line with the club going bust for whatever reason. True, they can, but there were allegations of their time in charge of financial misdeeds. There was an investigation when they were running the club with Karen Brady before they went on to West Ham. There were police raids. There was question marks over the finances and how the club was run. Whether you agree with Sullivan and Gold or you prefer them over, anyone else, their previous stint in owning Birmingham City was not without controversy and without allegations of improper conduct. Now, I'm not going to agree or disagree with who should be or who shouldn't be the owner or a director or an investor in a football club. What I am concerned about right now is the state of the game and the weakness and sense of governance on the part of the Football League. Now, suddenly they got very, very involved in the Derby County takeover, but they allowed Bury to go tits up, but they saved Bolton. Didn't understand the logic of that one. And what I think has forced the EFL to suddenly become a little bit more involved with Derby County is when you've got a club the size of Accrington Stanley coming out saying, well, those 2 games that we had scheduled on the league structure, not excluding cup games that you would play like the league trophy, the League Cup, the FA Cup, hypothetically you could play against your league rivals. But when you had the owner of Accrington Stanley, the chairman, going, we've just lost £250,000 in revenue from those home and away games not being played that we have planned for our budgets for this coming season, which ultimately was impacted by COVID anyway, which really blew any forecasting for budgets out the window. When in good times, a club um, saying, "Hang on a second, we've just lost. If this club goes bust, we've lost £250,000 in revenue from one club going out of business." Imagine if Derby County goes out of business. What the ACT would say then? We've lost 2-3 million in revenue. That's going to be a stinging indictment of the Football League's structures when it comes to the governance side of the game and the transparency of the takeover system and who owns what. The transparency of club ownership is sometimes very, very vague. Mark Warburton poised to join Birmingham with John Eustace. I would say Mark Warburton's a decent coach with decent experience. I think the situation with Birmingham is not the coaching staff or the players that you've got necessarily. I think this is where player agents and the debate about how much power player agents have within the game and the lack of transparency with player agents is more of an issue. It's the ownership side of things in the stadium situation. I think is more troubling for Birmingham City than the overpaid players. They've obviously got very good agents or very unscrupulous agents who can make them a lot of money. Which is another problem with the game right now, the sport right now is the role of player agents. It's the role of and you could argue this about a lot of sports actually, the role of player agents and the lack of transparency in regards to that sector of of sport is the player agents and how much money they make and the transparency over contract negotiations and what constitutes a third party payment, a whole host of other issues. I would say Mark Warburton and Eustace are a good combination there. I think the bigger concern is the off-field dramas with Birmingham City and the stadium issue. The stadium issue for me is a massive concern. With half the stadium, not allowed for use because of asbestos and structural issues, that's a bigger concern for me than who's your manager, who's your playing squad. The fact that your home stadium is in poor repair, the fact that there's an ownership issue and issues surrounding certain investigations into Birmingham City and the ownership and the funding is a bigger concern for me. And the fact that like Peter Kenyon's involved with an attempted bid to buy massive stake in Everton is a concern. Now Peter Kenyon is a guy I want running a football club. Who I want involved. If I'm a football fan, I want Peter Kenyon involved with my football team. The Everton situation, similar to Birmingham City, similar to Derby, there are concerns about the direction the ownership's taking and rule breaking and financial misdeeds and then the questions do get asked of the Premier League and the EFL about the directors' test and about financial fair play. Why are you not properly enforcing this? Bassini states they would spend 30 million for a championship squad to spend 5-10 years ago was a decent amount of money. Now, not so much because the transfer market is overinflated. But what we've seen with the amount of free players leaving on free transfers who are available, just winding down their contracts is very, very interesting. Yes, there's been a couple of big moves like Sadio Mane leaving Liverpool to go to Bayern, but he goes for less money than what he's worth. I think the Sadio Mane transfer, I think, is a deflation. Is actually a recorrection of the transfer market to where it should be. I think Sadio Mane, I think it's 34 or 35 million. I think that's a correction of the transfer market. But the fact that one player has gone for more than your transfer budget, in the last couple of days, just tells you all you need to know about the situation with club finances further down the pyramid. It wasn't that long ago that Birmingham were a Premier League side, so it does tell you. You have to ask the question: where's the money gone? Why's the investment gone to pot? Why are you in the situation you are, and why the stadium is in such a mess? You have to ask those questions. But it is what it is. Honestly, it is what it is. Like, if you can pick up some good deals in the transfer market. I mean, if you take away Derby County's points deduction last season, they finished well above you in the league and you're relegated. A lot of that side was signed on free transfers. That is what's ridiculous about the Derby County form, is their form was better than the season before. You just have the points deduction. And that's why I think Wayne Rooney is a very undervalued coach. I think he's very underrated, and for what he's done with the limited resources he's had available at Derby and the situation at Derby County. And now there's a situation where he may leave the club and there's no uncertainty. There are clubs looking for a manager who can work under very difficult circumstances. Wayne Rooney's your guy. Um, but we'll see what happens in regards to Birmingham City and what happens this summer. Derby County is an ongoing situation. The threat of liquidation is very, very real, and that really poses a massive headache for um, the EFL because they can't afford another club to go bust, and that would automatically mean Wrexham become a football league club all over again because they would have to alter the league structure by bringing another club into the football league to replace a club that's been thrown out. So Wrexham could benefit from um, Derby County going bust if they were to do so. But there are massive ramifications for a club going out of business. Massive ramifications. Um, of the likes we haven't seen since, I would say, Rangers getting thrown out of the Scottish Premiership and ending up in the Scottish League Two, and having to reform. Massive ramifications. I think that's as big a ramification as we could see. But the Scottish league system is run differently to the English league system in regards to liquidation rules and administration rules. But that's the closest we could see is similar to a Rangers where the name exists, but the club has to reform and start from the bottom all over again. Um, but though the Birmingham situation is, as I say, very, very similar and could lead to a similar outcome. But this is what I find amazing is football should be the most profitable industry you can find in sport. It should be the amount of money within the game. You say that the amount of money within the game. The sport is built upon unstructured debt, basically. Um, and it's built upon bad loans, and the system is overinflated. The wages are out of control, um, and that has been happening again for the last 25, 30 years. And this is where the question was asked earlier. Could the Premier League bring in a salary cap? It would have to be UEFA sanctioned, and every European top league would have to bring in a similar salary cap kind of structure. Um, and I think the players would have to, at that point, be open to taking a pay cut or a pay freeze. I'm not seeing that many players really realistically wanting to have their wages reduced or their wage increases reduced in size or their contracts changed. I cannot see the enough from the playing group across Europe to have their wages shrunk or to take pay freezes where like we're going to cap your salaries for a while. It's the only I can't see it. It's the logical way to go about it, but the contracts players have signed, especially those players who've just signed 5 or 6 year extensions. If you were to bring in salary cap 2 years' time, some of those players will have 3, 4 years to run on those contracts, and suddenly that becomes a very difficult legal situation where like the contracts have to be honoured, and then especially with the Mbappe contract, with what UEFA are proposing to bring in regards to um, club spending rules, the Mbappe contract is going to be a dead weight for PSG. It's going to be near on impossible to operate under the proposed European system they want to bring in. It'll also be interesting to see how much longer the current ownership of PSG hangs around. And same with the Man City. Very, very interesting to see how long um, you know, they stay in place. And with various investigations against these clubs for rule breaches, their punishments don't fit the crime, but it's not good. It's not a good look. But as I say, the sport is in a very tough spot right now. But I'm looking forward to the Women's Euros, though. The Women's Euros, I've got to do a preview video on that. I've got to do my club history video on Derby. I've got to have a look at the World Cup venues 2026. I think there's only one that now needs expansion, planned expansion for the tournament 4 years down here. It's the Toronto Stadium. So yeah, I've got a couple of video ideas, but I've actually gonna hop off for now. I do appreciate the questions. We haven't even discussed England winning the second test, and England trying to chase down that record-breaking one-day international run total, and getting close to the record and trying to break the 500 run record in a one-day international. So there are some other sports stories taking place. Obviously, Wimbledon's around the corner. Could this be a swan song for Federer and Murray and Nadal and Djokovic? I mean, are they really winding down their careers? How much longer do these players keep playing in professional tennis? And there's a whole host of other bits and pieces. So there we go. Wimbledon's around the corner. You've got Women's Euros. You've got Tour de France. So it's going to be a busy July. Very busy July. And it had also been 10 years since the Summer Olympic Games in London. So 10 years on. How time flies. Time has flown by in the last decade since the London Olympics. And there's obviously been lots of things in the news about various negative stories that have come out about the culture within various sports, like gymnastics, cycling, canoeing, in regards to the Olympic programs within the British sports system, and more negativities coming out, more damning reports about athlete welfare not being upheld, win at all costs, funding linked to medals wins rather than development, long-term development. Whole host of negative headlines that need to be discussed at some point. But thank you very much for all your questions. I really appreciate it. I will have some more content for you very, very soon. Keep your eyes open later today. And for me, it's goodbye for now.